Welcome to the Vernuccio Novak Report and the American Political Zone. From New York, this is Frank Vernuccio.
And from Washington, this is Daria Novak.
Daria, sometimes I think the most interesting parts of the show are when we prepare for it and are having a discussion off camera. You were mentioning something about the Aral Sea that I was fascinating. Go.
Well, it really is. This is an area that is inside basically Russian territory, Kazakhstan area. For those who aren't familiar, if you think of the old areas that are the border states along the Soviet Union. Well, the reason this is interesting today is that Kazakhstan is very friendly, relatively friendly to Moscow. And what we have right now is China stealing water from Kazakhstan farmers. Now, this has become actually a big situation because so much water is being stolen from Kazakhstan that it's caused all kinds of demonstrations and riots there against the Chinese government. So here we have, on the one hand, the superpowers, if you want to call it, that are great powers in the world, China and Russia, saying that they're very friendly toward each other. Yet Kazakhstan, which has a relatively large landmass and is an important area between, if you want to say, Europe, Russia, and Asia, now really having unrest foment there over the water supply. Now, if you want to say, how much water, why does it matter, Frank? An American has 5 glasses of clean water to drink for every single glass a Chinese citizen has. We have literally 5 times the amount. So we don't think of it. We turn on a tap and there's the water. But with what the Chinese are doing by blocking the water supply from going into Kazakhstan, not only are they depriving that area of drinking water, but also the farmlands there, the rolling hills that are the agricultural areas that are supplying crops for other regions there. The water supply is being curtailed so much that just like the Aral Sea in that region dried up, so may parts of Kazakhstan. In particular, Lake Balkhash, which is the 15th largest freshwater lake in the world, may soon dry up if this continues. Now, Frank, we might say, why is this important? Well, if the United States has to face off in some type of potential military action in the future, will we be facing a unified China, Russia, Iran alliance against Western Europe and the United States? What I'm saying about this is we're seeing little cracks starting now in that alliance, if you want to call it an alliance, at least a partnership. I think that we need to pay attention to the things that are happening in this part of the world. And right now, we don't hear a lot about anything besides COVID.
It's fascinating. If you go back through history, a great number of wars have begun over water rights. And in fact, if you go to the American West, back in when the period was being settled, there were numerous battles between settlers over who had rights to water. There's a whole area of American law called riparian water rights, which is a hotly contested, or has been a hotly contested area. If you live in the United States, for the most part, you don't really think that much about the availability of water. And yet around the world, it's a major factor. And I think you bring up an important point. As we were discussing off air, there is really no reason for the United States and the West as a whole to be at loggerheads with Russia, except for the stubbornness and I think the dreams of restoring the Soviet Empire of Vladimir Putin. That's a fight between Vladimir Putin and the West. It's not a fight necessarily between Russia's interest and the West.
You're very correct. And here's another thing to really watch out for. In the late 1950s, the Soviet Union refused to give China the bomb.
Mhm.
The Russians today really don't want to see China on equal par with them. What they do want to see is China giving the United States and the West a run for our money. So what we have is, yeah, Russia wants to see a little bit of conflict here and there, as long as, we're aiming it toward the Chinese and upset with the South China Sea and all of that. We're expending resources on China, and we're really not paying that much attention to Russia, which is good for Russia because financially they're restrained. They cannot afford to keep the military and that they have. And we have seen Russia change the type of strategy they're using. They're moving from highly technical long-range nuclear devices to battlefield nukes
Mhm.
that they've tested out along their border regions. And what this tells me is the Soviets, the Tsarist Russians, and even the Russians today have always been worried about a two-front war. On the east from the Mongols or the Chinese, and then from the west. Basically what the Russians are doing is they don't have the dollars or the rubles, and they don't have the military manpower to overtake large land masses. They basically want to secure their own borders. And Frank, how would we feel, do you think, if we had nuclear weapons facing the United States on the Canadian and Mexican border? In essence, Russia with NATO forces is facing that type of a situation on their border. They want it secured. So I think we need to do another thing. We usually look at foreign policy issues from an American perspective. If we look at it from a Russian perspective, I think we see a whole nother story here. I am not advocating Moscow as an ally of the United States the way it is today, but what I am saying is that we have to look at what these problems are and how close China and Russia actually are to each other. And is there any room in there for us to put a wedge there? And I believe there is, because Russia does not identify itself as an Eastern nation any more than it does, or perhaps less so, as a European one. So it's going to be really interesting moving forward as China makes inroads into countries like Georgia on the Black Sea to try to have access to European markets, to see what the Russian reaction is. I think we're going to see more fractures develop.
Yeah, it's a fascinating line of thought when you think of what could have happened if Boris Yeltsin had been perhaps in better health and stayed in power longer, as opposed to Vladimir Putin. I think Yeltsin, whatever faults people say he had, and I'm not sure how much of that was honest and how much of that was made up by the KGB, certainly was more pro-Western in his outlook. And I think if he had endured longer, you would see a very different Russia and indeed a very different world today. So,
Very much so. And, here's something else to consider. When I just mentioned Georgia, Georgia was making moves toward joining NATO. And there's certain requirements when a country joins NATO. They have to be democratic, have control over their territory. There's a whole set of criteria. They were making moves in that direction and trying to form partnerships with Western nations, with the EU. That threatened Russia. Now, Putin, being a strategist, and like him or not, in a brilliant move in 2008, invaded two small provinces in northern Georgia.
mhm.
They have only around 70,000 people. And basically, they keep moving the outposts around. It's basically just to say that they've occupied the territory, that small area. By doing that, it prevents Georgia from ever being able to join NATO until those Russian troops are gone. Now, did Putin want to take over the entire country? I don't know, but he didn't do it. He basically was doing it from a national security point of view to protect over the border, as they call it, to protect that region that was the Warsaw Pact going up through there. We see a similar thing with the Ukraine in 2014 with the takeover of the Crimea, with protecting the port at Sevastopol, which again was a Russian military port, giving them access into the Black Sea and the Mediterranean. So, when we look at countries that are aggressive, Frank, I think we also need to look at, is Russia being aggressive toward Western Europe and toward the United States in the same way that China is literally around the globe today, in Latin America, in Africa, in the South China Sea, in the Arctic? I think we see two very different agendas.
Yeah, and again, I think the agenda is a personal one to Vladimir Putin. His dream of restoring the Soviet Empire. After all, Vladimir Putin is an old KGB guy, and I don't think he's ever been reformed. While you might say Gorbachev and then Yeltsin, and perhaps other leaders of this Russian hierarchy have accustomed themselves to Russia being Russia and not the Soviet Union. Vladimir Putin has not broken free from that at all. And as long as he continues along those lines, and as long as he sees himself as a robber baron rather than just the leader of a country, I mean, the guy is probably the richest man in the world at this point, mostly from the theft of private enterprise in Russia and people investing in Russia, you're not going to see much in the way of reform.
And domestically, again, I don't want to sound like I'm pro Putin just because the guy can go around and wrestle bears and fly fish without his shirt on, though I will admit it's a lot nicer to look at than some Buddha-like figuring in, China with the bellies and stuff. But putting that part aside, you have to look at Putin and say, what does he have to go on internally? He's facing off with an oligarchy there, the Russian mafia. So he has his own domestic internal problems with the consumer economy, with pollution in the country, unemployment issues, and really making sure that the Russian mafia helps him. And in return, he helps the Russian mafia to
Well, let
keep
me ask
things
you something, though.
stabilized.
Is Putin the Russian mafia?
I don't know that he is it, but he certainly works with the Russian mafia, with these oligarchs that are incredibly powerful, unlike anything we've ever seen in the United States. But for Putin to stay in power, he needs to have them on his side.
I mean, the tragedy in Russia is that the foreign investment that could have gone in, if in fact they had dealt fairly with foreign investors, would have dramatically changed the Russian economy. Hey, Daria, let's go to our first guest. David Soderberg is a research associate for the Free Enterprise Project at the National Center for Public Policy Research. And he writes that Freedom to Learn calls on Congress to strengthen protections for students or develop a detailed intellectual freedom charter and to reform civics education. Davis, welcome to the program.
Hey, thanks for having me.
I think if there's one thing that is crystal clear is that American education basically is less education at this point than hard left propaganda. Is that your impression as well?
Yeah, after my experience at college, this is kind of the conclusion that I came to. I've basically been saying that we shouldn't believe that a college degree is a sign of superior intelligence anymore, and that it's just proof that another poor soul has fallen for the liberal mousetrap, as I like to call it. I envisioned idea sharing and open debate and learning, yet it really wasn't so much of that. And what I declared as is a woke indoctrination machine with a predetermined agenda that students are supposed to be hypnotized by.
When you look at the fact that taxpayer dollars are paying particularly for colleges, and essentially the students are not being given First Amendment rights, I mean, isn't this open to some kind of taxpayer action where tax dollars are essentially paying for left-wing propaganda?
Right, that's exactly right. And higher education in the United States, public higher education, it is the framework for that is the federal legislation, the Higher Education Act. And it creates the framework for federal involvement in higher education and creates the standards that these institutions must meet to receive federal grants, ultimately, which is the taxpayer money. But in 2020, federal funds accounted for nearly half of the revenue of American higher education institutions. It's basically leaving these entities at the mercies of the government. So if they're not doing what the government has put in place, they won't receive the federal funds. Plus, the Higher Education Act has helped slingshot leftism on college campuses. And this is what I'm calling for reform in.
And how could that reform take place? What's the step to do that?
So obviously, they would have to pass legislation in Congress to reform the bill. And the National Association of Scholars has put out a piece called the Freedom to Learn. And this document kind of lays out the framework of what they would change to the Higher Education Act. which was revised in 2008, but obviously that was during the Obama administration and not many great changes were made to it. So the three main things that the Freedom to Learn would do is strengthen viewpoint protections for students and develop a detailed intellectual freedom charter. And the other thing that I think is really important and we don't talk enough about is reforming civic education.
You know, I think that is a really important one. Believe it or not, I'm in my 60s and I just went back to school to finish a PhD that I had started years ago. I'm very lucky at my university that you're allowed to have freedom of opinion, but I have heard from so many people that not only can they not have their own opinion or hold it or express it, but they're not even taught about civics either at the high school, the college, or the graduate school level today. It seems as if it's been eliminated from the curriculum. Do you find that to be the case in many locations?
Yeah, I think they teach civic education incorrectly. They put too much emphasis on the activism aspect of it. They don't teach American philosophy and American thought processes of our founders, who were the people who gave us the government that has lasted 250 years and has helped us prosper. There's such a lack of understanding of American history and the values that have held us together. The students no longer believe that the government's sole purpose is to protect the rights of the citizens, but rather it's to be the holy gift bearer to the people. And it's really helped grow this belief in progressivism and that big government is good, when in reality that's not what our nation was founded on. And I think there's a lack of sound education for our youth or for the college students that ultimately is translating into them developing this leftist ideology, which they're going to take with them as they get older into important decision-making roles in society.
You know, the issue, I think, is not so much a question of a particular political point of view as much as it is the freedom of students to gain an actual impartial education, which is clearly not occurring in our universities. And indeed, you can make the case that it's not even happening in high schools or even grammar schools. I think we tend to see this as a college problem, but in fact, isn't it now right down to the grammar school level?
Yeah, and obviously with the current state of things, with the rise of critical race theory and anti-racism, it's only going to be amplified. But to your point, that's exactly right. I'm not saying that they're teaching leftism now and then they should switch over to start teaching the conservative ideology. What I'm saying is give students the freedom to learn all sides and debate based off of that, to where we are having an intellectual battle on whose ideas are better. So let me just give you an example of something that I saw when I was in school. We went into a class once and the professor put up onto the screen something that he had the title of the 4 biggest problems facing American society. And the 4 of them were income inequality, a lack of universal health care, racial inequality, and a lack of diversity in corporate hierarchy. And I'm sitting there saying, well, you just decided what the biggest problems were. Why didn't you let us debate as a class what they were? And then he puts out all these solutions, and then the kids take that out into the real world as if they're undeniable truth.
You know, David, I've got to ask you this question, and I'll tell you why after you give me your answer. Do you think conflict is good? In this sense, having political conflict on campuses or in high schools, in clubs after school, things like that. Another word for conflict being debate.
Yes, I think it is extremely important. And I think that that's something that has gotten away from college campuses. Kids they're so worried about offending other people because of this world that we are in now, of where people are declaring hate speech and bigotry and all of these things just when someone disagrees with you or brings up a different viewpoint. And because of that, it's really crippling learning and debate and idea sharing on college campuses.
You know what?
Go ahead, Daria.
I'm just going to say, you know, Frank and I have talked about this before, where when we were in college and starting out, everywhere you had free speech. in the classroom. You could debate your professor. Of course, it was respectful, but everybody could hold an opinion. And as long as you could give a good reason for having that opinion, you could get an A in that class. Today, it seems that there's cancel culture everywhere. Do you find that it's unacceptable, not just not just unfavorable, but actually unacceptable to hold differing opinions from the progressive left on campuses today?
Yeah, like we said, debate needs to start flourishing again. And I think there's this part of the conservative student that when they go to class, they almost sit there and they think, is it worth it? Is it worth it for me to dive into this? I just want to go about my business. I want to get a good grade in the class. I know that the professor is ideologically against me. I don't want that to hurt me. I know a majority of my students are against me. Is it really worth it? And I would tell them, yes, it is. Because although we can put this federal legislation in place and reform the Higher Education Act to help it, ultimately it's going to come down to conservative students sticking up for what they believe in. And it's a really hard ask, but if they do that and they come with their facts prepared, they know the policies they support, and they have a chance to really turn the ideological debate around and allow freedom to finally flourish in thought on college campuses.
So what's happening today? Can you tell our audience, with conservative organizations, are they allowed to exist on campus? Are they flourishing? Are there problems for students that want to join them?
I would say that there's not issues for people who want to join them, but I would encourage people to go look at places like PragerU and Turning Point USA, and specifically go to their YouTube channels about them debating leftist students on campuses, and you will see the hostility towards conservative viewpoints. It's incredible. But as people like Charlie Kirk and Will Witt and the people who are part of the young conservative movement on college campuses continue to stand up, their popularity is growing so large that they're showing kids that it's okay to go out in the fire. It's okay to stand up for what you believe in. Those organizations are really becoming important. And there's so many statistics that show that leftism is just continuing to grow, and it needs to be countered immediately, because we're getting to an irreversible point to where it's going to be hard to get back to where intellectual freedom and viewpoint discrimination is no longer part of it.
You know, Frank, I just have to relate something that happened to me a couple of years ago. I was invited to speak on the U.S. Constitution at a college in Connecticut. It was a panel session. I was probably going to be on, my guess, 15, 20 minutes, you know, typical of a panel, and you do a Q&A with a few other professors. I believe very strongly in the Constitution and following it. And when it came down to the actual meeting, I received a call from the college that I was disinvited by the college president, not because of my qualifications, but because of my belief in the Constitution. And they didn't want that on a Connecticut state campus. You know what, David, do you find this just to be outrageous?
It is really outrageous. And that's another one of those things, is not giving. I'm not saying that we need to turn all curriculum to conservative right-wing thinking, but just like you said, if they're going to have speakers on the left that come who don't believe in the Constitution, they need to equally have people on the other side. And one of the things that the Freedom to Learn from the National Association of Scholars, which is the reform piece proposed to the Higher Education Act, is a diversity of speakers on campuses. And that's another really important one, like you just brought up, was a perfect example.
You know, I grant you, Davis, that I went to college when dinosaurs still roamed the earth, but there was the typical personality of a college student was somewhat rebellious and somewhat curious. And it seemed to me that one of the fun things about being in college was you listened to all sorts of different points of view. You agreed, you disagreed, you argued, but you had fun listening to different perspectives. And I don't think, for all the faults of college students in my era, that the thought of censoring someone would ever have come up. In fact, because I think of the somewhat rebellious nature of college students in the 60s and 70s, the whole idea of censorship was anathema. Even on the heart, I mean, certainly conservatives always felt that way, but even on the left, you had the free speech movement out at Berkeley. How did this get to this point where censorship is so acceptable, where students, rather than being rebellious, seem almost cowed by left-wing authoritarian college authorities?
It's a fear of backlash against their viewpoints. That is one. Actually, this brings me to a different point. Now on college campuses, there's these things called free speech zones, which
Right.
really crack me up. It's like, why is there a zone? Isn't all of campus free speech zone? It's really unbelievable. And there's one point I really want to touch on, because I've been thinking about why students have so easily moved to leftism. And I think there's an underlying thing that people don't talk about enough. These students have grown up in a generation where media headlines and 150 character tweets is where they get their information. They see free college, they see universal health care, they see AOC calling for $20 minimum wage hikes, and in their head it sounds great, but they don't read into the headlines, and they only hear the talking points. They never dive down into the research and understand the unintended consequences of these policies. So it's just a result of the fast-paced nature of the world they've grown up in, and they just want their information in under 15 seconds. So there's a lot of obstacles to overcome, but I think the first thing to do is acknowledge it and get the word out that this is happening on college campuses, so then ultimately we can come up with a better plan to combat it.
What then do the taxpayers do to fight this? I mean, obviously, I think parents sending those tuition bucks to colleges have some rights involved. I would think that if you told a college that they had to teach a pro-life course as opposed to an abortion course, that they had to make statements endorsing conservatism, there would be a hue and a cry that you're using a college campus for political purposes. But that's exactly what the left is doing and totally getting away with it. Is there something legislative that should be done to say that colleges cannot continue to use taxpayer dollars for partisan political politics?
Yeah, that is exactly right. It's going to come down. They're going to have to be some reform in legislation, like you said, and it could be that they're not going to receive grants if they are clearly discriminating against a certain viewpoint. It's really a tough situation, and people reach out to your legislators, reach out to the people within your state or at the universities. We have to stop this now. And of course, we have a federalist system, so there can be legislation that takes place in the state level to hopefully counter it a little bit. But still, there needs to be reform to the Higher Education Act. So it's not a simple solution, and I think it's going to take quite a bit of time, but we need to start taking steps forward.
You know, Davis, when I talk to young people today, I hear them often say that they don't believe in the institutions that we have. They don't believe in the leadership. They don't trust the leadership is the word that I hear typically. And this comes from both the left and the right. Do you find that young people today, say college age and just above, trust less in the solution set because they trust less in the institutions? Do they feel hopeful, do you think, that this kind of a problem can be resolved?
Well, I would say that the distrust in institutions comes from two different angles. From the left, it is one that's been engraved in them, a distrust because of systemic racism, and that our country has been built in a way that is skewed to a certain ideological group. However, my distrust in the government comes just from a philosophical belief of, I don't like centralized power somewhere. I like the power to be in the individual. For instance, give me a set of arguments and let me decide as the individual. I don't want someone crafting a curriculum that is specifically for one ideology that I'm meant to fall for. So I think in terms of institutional distrust, it's a tough question because there are so many different approaches to that distrust.
You know, I find when we have discussions about this topic, we talk about the students, we'll talk about college administration, but one topic that never gets discussed enough is the intimidation of professors. Daria mentioned one example that she endured when she was disinvited to speak. But don't we see in the hiring of professors real discrimination against moderate or conservative professors? We've looked at statistics, Daria and I have over the years, that indicate there's practically no Republican or conservative oriented professors on campus. And those few that are there certainly fear for their career lives. They're not going to get tenured. They're not going to get treated properly.
Yeah, I totally agree. And whether they are conservative or not, they're fearful that they'll get backlash if they come out as admitting it. There was actually a Higher Education Research Institute did a survey of 1,600 higher education institutes nationwide, and the percentage of faculty that identified with the far left has really grown by an extraordinary rate. Just 30 years ago, there was 24% of them said that they were on the far left, and now it's up to 48%. So it is continuing to grow as the same number of conservative professors that say they're conservative is going down. And students are affected by that. Students see that person as an intellectual higher being. That person's giving them their grade. So of course they're going to snuggle up to whatever the professor says is correct.
I've spoken to professors at colleges and universities here in New York City, and they frequently say that by the time a student gets to the college level, they've already been indoctrinated in leftist ideology. I mean, they have gone through 8 years of grammar school and 4 years of high school, basically of hard left stuff. So doesn't this begin at such a lower level that by the time you get to college, it's almost too late to balance the scales?
Yes and no. I agree to a point where there is definitely values formed when you're younger, and that starts around the dinner table. I'm a big believer in that. But I also believe that when these kids venture off to college, it's the first time that they're feeling true individual freedom. They're away from their parents. They're not living at home. They don't go to high school every day with the same people. It's different classes. There's different groups of people. There's different professors. You're in a whole new environment. You don't go and sleep at home. You sleep with your roommate or other people on campus. And I think there is definitely an area of learning ideologically when you get to college campuses. So I think there's a little bit of learning when you're younger, but it definitely stems a little bit from when you're on college campuses. I would disagree with someone who says they're already fully indoctrinated when they get there.
Now, do you find that young people today are, outside of the 2020 year anyway, signing up to vote more often? Because what we saw when the 18-year-olds first got the vote was an increase in the first election cycle that young people voted, but after that it dropped off. Do you see people looking to sign up to vote again?
Yeah, especially this last year, because there was such a hatred for President Donald Trump. So they wanted to get him out of office. And at least from my viewpoint on my college campus, there was everywhere you went, there was people telling you to register to vote. There was activists around campus on the grounds supporting some political initiative, provision, candidate, whatever it may be. So I obviously went to school around the Washington, D.C. area, so politics is obviously a bigger deal here. But yes, kids are becoming more and more engaged in politics and in public life. So I think we really need to start targeting the youth and making sure that they're able to have, they're able to hear all viewpoints so that they can make decisions for themselves on what's best, rather than just being indoctrinated when they go and get affected by university curriculum.
You know, I just want to add one thing for any in our audience. If you have young people and 18 to 24 in that critical age period, if you can get them to vote during every one of those elections, statistics show they'll be a voter for life. So for those of you who are, I'm saying, who are Republican and conservative out there, go get those kids to vote. Davis, we are, I think, starting to see young people stand up again in this country and start to become interested in politics, just like we're seeing on the progressive left. Do you see that same thing on your campus, where conservatives are becoming more agitated at what's happening to them?
Yeah, I've been off campus for 2 years now, but basically during my experience, the most amount of people that I found were conservatives were the ones that came up to me silently, knowing that I was a conservative. They would come say, yeah, I totally agree. I can't believe what's going on campus. They never really spoke out, but there was always that core base of conservatives on college campuses that were just silent. But they need to be silent no more. They need to stand up, and they need to start getting into the debate on college campuses. And the reason that's so important is because, yes, there are liberal students that are outspoken. Yes, there are silent conservatives. But when the silent conservatives don't speak up, they aren't getting that middle group of students who is yet to affiliate with one ideology. So if the conservatives aren't speaking up to counter the arguments of the left, naturally those people in the middle are just going to fall to leftism.
There's an uncomfortable part of this that I think we still have to address, and that is, to what extent is it the fault of Republican organizations to not really pay attention to what's going on campus? I've seen situations where a young Democrat group on a college campus will have an event, and the local Democratic Party will buy the food, supply the speakers, sometimes even pay for a band. The Republican organization in the area, well, they're lucky if they have one 80-year-old guy show up to say 2 words. So to some extent, is it the fault of Republican organizations for not really paying attention to what goes on campus?
That's a good question. I wouldn't go out of my way to just throw it all on their shoulders, of course. I think everyone in the conservative movement, whether you're young, middle-aged, old, it doesn't matter. Everyone has to play their part, but that's a really good point. I think not just organizations like Turning Point USA, like I said, or PragerU, but all organizations, even Republican action groups that have a different role, whether it's for legislation advocacy in the federal government, whatever. They need to start playing a bigger part in the youth. They need to start playing a bigger part on college campuses, because ultimately, if we want our party to continue to grow and continue to flourish and have our ideas govern our country, then we need leaders for the next generation that are going to support the conservative movement.
Davis, it's been a great conversation. Look forward to our next one.
Thanks a lot. I really appreciate it.
Keep up the great work.
Thank you.
It is fascinating, but I do continue to think that in many cases, Republicans simply don't reach out as much as they should towards young people. I think we've seen that for many years, and I think that now, considering how hard the hard left has actually gotten, I think it's more urgent than ever.
I have to agree with you. I've been around the country in different states and looking at political organizations, and I find it amazing how many summer jobs are there for PERG and other these left-wing groups that are giving out dollars to students over the summer for jobs, just to go do survey work or anything. And what they're doing is they're organizing these youth at an early age, and the Republicans don't seem to be doing that. We seem to be sitting back and saying that politics is not 365 days a year. It seems for some reason Republicans think it starts after Labor Day and ends in November with the election. And I think that, that's a nice ideal to have, a short election cycle, one that's not costly, self-contained, and then let the person who wins the election govern. But the reality is, Frank, we're facing off with those in the country that are working at this 24/7 every day of the year. And I think that unless we have 2 viable and strong parties, we're going to be in a pretty bad situation in this country.
I think we're already there. Daria, we were talking about the show, and this is this kind of special week of the year. It's sandwiched between Passover and Easter. And one of the things that doesn't get enough attention, I believe, is the repression, particularly of Christians around the world. We all know the plight of Israel and the Middle East and how dire that is, the sad history of anti-Semitism that continues to this day. And by the way, apropos of our prior conversation, the anti-Semitism on college campuses continues to grow by leaps and bounds. It sometimes masks itself as the BDS movement, the boycott and disinvest in Israel movement, but it's actually pretty traditional anti-Semitism. But what we're seeing around the world today is a solid attack against Christianity. Some have looked at it and say that Christians are more repressed now than they were in the days of the Caesars, when the martyrs were sent into the lion pits of the Colosseum. Whether you're looking at China, where Christian buildings are not allowed to be displayed, where Christians are really suffering severe discrimination, in North Korea, where it is actually illegal under North Korean law just to be a Christian. We don't have to talk much about what happens to Christians in places like the Middle East or in parts of Africa, where Christians are treated horribly. In North Africa, we've seen headlines just over the past month or so where Christians are abducted, killed, churches are burned, and so forth. There was a World Watch study recently that concluded that Christians are indeed the most repressed religion across the planet. 12 Christian churches are destroyed every day. Double-digit Christians are arrested, killed, or imprisoned each and every day across the globe. This is a story that the press, I think, rather scrupulously avoids reporting on.
They do. And it had to take a bit of digging for me to find an article this week that came out of France. And what it said was the Muslim population in Paris, France, issued a threat to the people of Great Britain that if you don't want Great Britain to become like France, you will respect and accept Muslims and do as we say. And the article went on to say that basically there's beheadings in France, there's killings in France, and we all have known about the machete attacks by Muslims in Paris, that they will bring this threat to England if England doesn't comply. We are seeing literally, in some ways, I think, Frank, a reenactment of the 1400s. We're seeing a reenactment of the time when there were wars of religious wars, I'll say. We've got to recognize that this is happening against Christians today, not just in France, not just in England or the United States, but literally around the world. We can travel into the Philippines, Southeast Asia, where there are booming communities of Christians, but they're still being threatened in their existence. We know that in China, this is happening too, not just in North Korea, where Christian churches are being shut down in China, as well as Buddhist mosques, Buddhist temples there. Religious freedom has to be front and center, especially this week. I think we need to take it into consideration.
And I think while we're looking around the world, we also have to look rather close to home as well. We've seen over the past couple of years, particularly during the Obama administration, a concerted attack against Christian institutions. We remember, of course, the Obama administration's attack on the Little Sisters of the Poor. They were told that they had to provide funding for coverage for abortion, which was clearly against their religious beliefs. It wasn't a question of whether you believe in abortion or not. That's not the issue. The issue is whether a religious organization should have the right to comply with their own religious beliefs in their own institutions. The Obama administration said no. We saw in the city of Houston, Texas, the mayor a couple of years ago said that she wanted Christian pastors to submit their Sunday homilies for pre-approval to the mayor's office. Now, that's something, when you read that, you think this can't be true. It is so absurd, it can't be true. It indeed was true. We are seeing these type of attacks against Christian institutions across the country. We remember the case of the Christian baker who said it was against their bakery, that said it was against their religious principles to bake a cake for a gay wedding. Again, the issue is not a gay wedding, whether you agree with that or not. The question is whether that institution, that private company, had the right to comply with their own religious beliefs. The court told them they could not do that. How far does this go?
Frank, when you talked about a person in government being allowed to dictate what goes on behind the pulpit, the first thing that came to mind is the Leviathan and Thomas Hobbes, when he wrote this is like 1600s. We're moving backwards, actually, if you think about it. In the 1600s, that the sovereign or the king or the president, the sovereign, should have absolute control. And that includes not only over government, but also over religion. And that the sovereign is the one that will determine what are the rules and what is acceptable. Are we going back 400 years? I mean, literally, we are seeing government become absolutely powerful. And I think that is even beyond the question of just religion. Can we sustain a free society when government is the dictator of our thoughts? I just don't see that that's possible going forward. I think that we lose our freedom of religion, our freedom of speech, our freedom of assembly. We've looked at what's happened, Frank, over this last year with COVID and all of the rules that really don't seem to work anyway, and what government is telling us, and fines that people have gotten, arrests they've been threatened with. How much do we have to take before the people fight back and say enough is enough? We need to go back to what the founders talked about with small government and local controls.
Yeah, just recently this discussion of COVID passports came up. Back when some of the restrictions based on COVID came about, some of us, and Daria, I believe you and I discussed this on an earlier program back, I think last spring, that we were concerned that the government would take the precedent of these COVID shutdowns and use it to permanently expand their powers. Two things that never seem to go away, taxes, and when a government expands their powers, they never seem to bring them back down after that emergency is over. Now we're talking about government saying they can permanently regulate whether you can travel from place to place. It kind of sounds like the old Soviet Union, where if you wanted to go from one province of the USSR to another province of the USSR, you had to get permission of the government to do so. An internal passport, it was called. Now we're seeing that Fauci and others are talking about instituting these internal passport concepts right here in the United States. This unbelievable expansion of government power just doesn't seem to stop. It just keeps getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And to your point, New York State, to take one example, permanently locked down or locked down substantially, as did California. Florida, on the other hand, didn't lock down very much at all. Now that the dust is starting to settle finally on COVID, we find something remarkable, that New York and California don't have any lesser infection rates than Florida did. Indeed, Florida actually has less problems than California and New York. The state of Texas recently completely opened up. No masks, no restrictions, nothing. We were told by Dr. Fauci, Dr. Bricks, and all the others, oh my God, Texas is going to die. Well, as it turns out, Texas is now having less COVID deaths than California or New York.
You made an important point with government expanding control over the population. I hope our audience is sitting down right now, because I just read a story where some members on the Democratic side of the House are proposing permanent payments by government to lower income individuals in this country. Now, these are people who would be working, not unemployed. We're not talking about extending just welfare to those who are getting welfare. I'm talking about a redistribution of income that would be permanent, to take those who are in the middle and upper classes and give away your hard-earned money to those who are in the lower income brackets, even even if they are working and earning an income. You know, when we talk about these radical kind of ideas that are so far out there, we bring that into the conversation, Frank, and then people start to say, well, we got to compromise on it. We need to throw this out and say this is below any type of acceptable compromise. We do not need to take people's hard-earned income and redistribute it to other people who are working. You know, when I heard this, I was just outraged because there are so many members of Congress that think this is a good idea. It's not just one individual radical, but the people in this country need to remember what are the consequences of a $600 or a $1,400 payment, or in the long run, what if we had to support people and every month or every 2 months give out $1,400 to our population? Can you imagine the level of debt, the level of inflation, the weakness that our country would be placed in globally? It's unacceptable.
Well, as I've mentioned on the show a number of times, I work with a number of small business groups. And one of the things that they are telling me this month is that because of the generosity, if you want to use that phrase, of government handouts and government doling out cash, they can't get their employees back to work because they are finding, with all the government bailouts and all the government money being given out, they make as much money staying unemployed as they do being employed, which you're destroying the entire crux of the American economy. What happens then? Well, these small businesses are starting to close down. They can't afford to stay open. They can't hire people, even if they could, to man their stores.
Or nursing homes.
Or nursing homes. That means more Americans unemployed, more government handouts, more inflation. It is a death spiral for the American economy, and it shows no sign of stopping. Because when this is happening, as these businesses are closing, when they don't have jobs anymore because they can't get employees, the government becomes bigger. The government becomes the big daddy to everyone. The government becomes the sole means of support. We are in the absolute mid stages of destroying the American economy. It makes no sense. You know, in every continent of the world, just about, where there are countries, where there are economic systems, they've tried socialism. In places as remote and different as South America and Russia, they've tried socialism. It's never worked. Now, some will point to China. China only exists as an independent economy because they can sell stuff to capitalist countries. You know, it is absolutely insane that we are treading down this path. And you try to talk to the Bernie Sanders, the Joe Bidens, the Kamala Harrises of the world. You try to have a basic discussion on economics, they don't want to hear it. And Davis mentioned during his interview that, you know, the young people hear these sound bites rather than distant arguments. Hey, everyone should get a minimum wage of X amount of dollars. Yeah, okay. What happens then when the jobs that were paying those minimum wages go out of business or automate themselves? One of the things we're seeing, particularly in the fast food industry, a local fast food place, you up the amount of minimum wage they have to pay, and so they go out and buy a machine that does what the employee did. That's less jobs. We're heading to a point, Daria, where, hey, why not say the minimum wage is $100 an hour? Because after all, there are no jobs, no one's going to pay them, but at least we can say that the minimum wage is nice and high, even though there's no job behind that minimum wage.
Well, you know what? The first thing that comes to mind is there goes the dollar menu at McDonald's. Because here's the reality. Companies are in business to make a profit. And if they can't make...
What a dirty word that is.
Oh, I know. Reasonable profits. I'm not saying, you know, doing something terrible, but that's the reality. They're there to make a profit. And if they have to pay $15 an hour for somebody to make a hamburger, the price of the hamburger is not going to be $1, but it's going to go way up. And I don't think that it is too much to ask any person to do a little bit of long-term thinking, not just the short term, and say, wait a minute, in the long run, just like Seattle, you're going to find that restaurants will shut down. I believe in Seattle, if I'm not mistaken, it was almost 200 restaurants and businesses that shut down due to their city enforcement of a $15 an hour minimum wage. You know, Frank, I just am amazed that people think, oh, good, I can get something for nothing. You know, you go to the store, what do they call it? BOGO, buy one, get one free.
Right.
You know what? We're going to have to come to a reality of this is how an economy works. If you raise wages, you're going to have to raise prices. We're going to be in the same situation, but instead of needing a wallet to go to the marketplace, we're going to be like Germany with wheelbarrows.
Right. Exactly right. Daria, it has been a fascinating conversation. Let's continue it next week. And to our audience, thanks for tuning in.
We welcome our newest radio affiliate, Net Talk America in Washington, D.C. at 96.7 FM. We're broadcast throughout the United States on radio and television and worldwide on the web. Watch us on Roku, public broadcast stations, and on the AM/FM 247.com network. You can access a program anytime on our website at usagovpolicy.gov. Join us again next week. We're sponsored by the New York Analysis of Policy and Government, a division of the American Analysis of News and Media, Inc., and the Institute for American Politics. Email us at truthinradio@gmail.com.
Our producer is the amazing Abigail White, and our director is the brilliant Jeff Hansen.